Porsche 911, driving in its purest form.
The word Porsche has always meant one thing: 911. A car so iconic, so entrenched in the brand's DNA that it has defied trends, regulations, and even physics itself for more than half a century. The 911 is untouchable, or at least that's what Porsche wanted you to believe. But by the early 2000s, cracks were forming in the foundation of their rear-engine empire. The 911 was growing, physically, financially, and technologically. It was still an incredible machine, but it was becoming too much car, too heavy, too complicated, and too expensive. Porsche had a problem. And in 2005, they accidentally solved it. They built a mid-engine sports car that handled better than the 911, was cheaper, and had near perfect balance. It was called the Cayman, and it was so good that Porsche immediately had to cripple it. To understand why the Cayman threatened Porsche's sacred 911, we have to rewind to the late 90s. Porsche, once the pinnacle of independent sports car manufacturing, had barely survived financial ruin. By the early 90s, their lineup was outdated, sales were dwindling, and their dependence on the 911 was dangerous. The 982, their long-shot attempt at a front-engine GT car, was dead. The 968, an evolution of the 944, was a slow seller. Porsche was hemorrhaging money, and the future of the company looked bleak. Then came the Boxster. The mid-engine Roadster was the lifeline Porsche needed. It was cheaper to build, easier to drive, and most importantly, wildly profitable. Sharing parts with the 911, the Boxster allowed Porsche to modernize its manufacturing process and re-establish itself as a force in the sports car world. It worked. By the late 90s, Porsche was not only recovering, but thriving. But success has consequences. The engineers, fresh off the success of the Boxster, saw an opportunity. They knew that the Boxster's chassis had untapped potential. Unlike the 911's rear-engine layout, an inherently flawed design Porsche had spent decades refining, the Boxster's mid-engine setup was dynamically superior. It had better weight distribution, a lower center of gravity, and a sharper turn. The engineers knew that if they took that chassis, stiffened it, and added a hardtop, they'd create something dangerous. So they did.
This is a 2008 Porsche Cayman, and it's just phenomenal.
In 2005, Porsche unveiled the Cayman. It was everything the engineers had dreamed of. A stiffer, sharper, and more focused version of the Boxster. And it was, by many accounts, the best handling Porsche ever made. But the executives were nervous. Porsche is not like other car manufacturers. Unlike Ferrari, Lamborghini, or McLaren, Porsche's identity isn't built around limited-run hypercars or high-revving V12s. Their entire existence hinges on the 911, and the Cayman was a direct threat. So they sabotaged it. From the very beginning, Porsche made sure the Cayman could never surpass the 911. They deliberately gave it less power, ensuring it would always be a step behind. They restricted its engine choices, kept its top-tier performance models at bay, and made sure the 911 remained the king of the lineup. But no amount of corporate politics could ever hide the truth.
That is the essence of a great mid-engine car, and it's why the Cayman will always slightly have an advantage over the 911.
Even in its nerfed state, the Cayman was a revelation. It was one of those rare cars that felt right from the moment you turned the wheel. The mid-engine layout gave it razor-sharp handling, perfect balance, and an intuitive sense of connection between driver and machine. It wasn't just that the Cayman was good, it made the 911 feel like a compromise. From a pure driving perspective, the 911 was always fighting physics. That signature rear-engine layout, while a hallmark of Porsche's identity, had been an engineering nightmare for decades. Porsche had spent millions refining it, adding electronic nannies, active suspension, and increasingly wider rear tires to counteract its fundamental flaw, having most of its weight hanging off the back of the car. The Cayman didn't need those tricks. It was naturally stable, neutral in corners, and far easier to push to the limit. In 2006, when the Cayman S hit the streets, the car world took notice. Reviewers immediately saw through Porsche's ploy. The Cayman wasn't just good, it was better than the 911. More balanced, more precise, and more fun. The only thing holding it back was Porsche itself. But Porsche stuck to the plan. Every generation of the Cayman was carefully kept under the 911's thumb. No matter how good it was, no matter how much potential the chassis had, the Cayman would never be allowed to surpass its older sibling. When the second generation 981 Cayman arrived in 2012, it was lighter, more rigid, and even sharper than before. It should have been a 911 killer, but Porsche made sure it wasn't. Despite its improved chassis, the Cayman was still starved for power. It got a slightly larger 3.4-liter flat six in the S model, but it was deliberately underpowered. Stuck at 325 horsepower, while the equivalent 911 Carrera had 350. It was another clear message from Porsche: this car will never get what it should be. Then, in 2015, something incredible happened. Porsche finally gave the world a Cayman GT4. It was the moment Cayman fans had been waiting for, a car that finally could compete with the 911 on equal footing. Porsche gave it a 3.8-liter flat six from the 911 Carrera S, stiffened the suspension, and added aggressive aerodynamics. On paper, it was a game changer, but there was still a catch. Porsche made sure the GT4 was still just a little worse than it could have been. The 3.8-liter engine was detuned to 385 horsepower, less than the 911 of the time. It was only available with a 6-speed manual, while the 911 GT3 got Porsche's ultra-fast PDK transmission. And worst of all, the gear ratios were comically long, making second gear capable of hitting nearly 85 miles per hour, neutering the car's acceleration. It was Porsche, once again, holding the Cayman back. And yet, despite all of these restrictions, the Cayman GT4 was still one of the best driver's cars Porsche had ever made. It was so balanced, so direct, so engaging that it left enthusiasts wondering what could have been. Porsche had built the perfect sports car, and again, they had deliberately hobbled it. And then, in 2016, Porsche did something unforgivable.
The 718 Cayman, with 425 liters of luggage space, for more sports per sports car.
Porsche did the unthinkable. They killed the Cayman's naturally aspirated flat six. For the 718 generation, Porsche swapped the Cayman's glorious 6-cylinder for a turbocharged 4-cylinder. It was, by all accounts, a technically competent engine. It made more torque, improved fuel efficiency, and aligned with tightening emissions regulations. But it came at a massive cost: character. The rich, sonorous wail of the naturally aspirated flat six, one of the defining features of a Porsche, was gone. In its place was a coarse, uninspiring drone that made the Cayman sound more like a Subaru WRX than a true sports car. Fans were furious. Porsche tried to justify the decision with environmental concerns, claiming the turbocharged 4-cylinder was necessary to meet modern emission standards. But the excuses fell flat. The 911, after all, still had the flat six. The flagship GT3 was still naturally aspirated, and when purists pushed back, Porsche's true intentions became obvious. They were intentionally demoting the Cayman. Porsche had done it again, kept the Cayman from reaching its true potential. By 2019, Porsche attempted to walk back the decision. They unveiled the 718 Cayman GT4, bringing back a naturally aspirated flat six, as if to acknowledge their mistake. But even then, Porsche made sure the Cayman remained in its place. The 4-liter flat six they gave the GT4 was impressive. After all, it was a naturally aspirated Porsche engine, but there was a catch. Instead of giving it a true GT engine, Porsche detuned a version of the 911's 3-liter twin-turbo flat six, removing the turbos to create a naturally aspirated 4-liter unit. The result, a power plant that, while thrilling to drive, lacked the high-revving madness of Porsche's GT engines. It had just 414 horsepower, significantly less than any comparable 911. Even worse, Porsche deliberately limited the car's top-end performance. Unlike the 911 GT3, which revved to 9,000 RPM, the Cayman GT4 was held back to 8,000 RPM, a small but clear reminder of its lower status. And yet, even in its neutered form, the GT4 was incredible. The balance, the mid-engine poise, the communicative steering, it was a driver's car in the purest sense. but Porsche made sure it still wasn't overshadowing the 911. The gearing was frustratingly long, meaning that on most back roads, second gear could take you to illegal speeds while third felt unnecessary. They made the car brilliant, yet flawed by design. Then, in 2022, Porsche did what many thought was impossible. They let the Cayman loose. The 718 Cayman GT4 RS was the Cayman purists has been waiting for. It finally got the proper engine. The 4-liter flat 6 from the 911 GT3, revving all the way to 9,000 RPM. It had 500 horsepower, a lightweight chassis, a massive aero package, and a PDK transmission that delivered lightning fast shifts. This was a Cayman that could go toe-to-toe with the 911 GT3. It was in many ways the Cayman's perfect form. But there was still a catch: the price. The GT4 RS started at $150,000, putting it dangerously close to the 911 Turbo. And when dealers get involved with their absurd markups and the dust from the configuration settles, the reality becomes clear. Most enthusiasts would never get to experience the car. Porsche had finally built the Cayman they were afraid of for years, but they had made sure it was priced out of reach. It was a dream car, but only for those willing to pay supercar money for a car that, in theory, should have always existed. The 718 era proved one thing: Porsche knew exactly what they were doing. They could make the Cayman unbeatable, they had just chosen not to. At this point, it's clear. Porsche doesn't want the Cayman to be a true rival to the 911. But why? The answer is simple: money. The 911 is Porsche's cash cow. It commands a higher price, attracts wealthier buyers, and carries a legacy that the company cannot afford to disrupt. The Cayman, no matter how good it is, will always be positioned as a second-tier car because it has to. If Porsche ever let the Cayman truly run free, gave it a 911 turbo engine, put it on a diet, and allowed it to dominate track times, the 911's mystique would be shattered. Porsche isn't dumb. They know enthusiasts love the Cayman. They know journalists constantly praise it. But they also know that making it too good would mean undermining the Crown Prince itself. So where does the Cayman go from here? Porsche has hinted that the next generation Cayman will go fully electric, and on paper, that might sound like a natural evolution. More power, instant torque, and improved efficiency. All the usual EV talking points. But for a car like the Cayman, this transition feels more like an execution than a step forward. For all its corporate imposed handicaps, every Cayman that Porsche has built has been a driver's car with soul. Even when Porsche gave it less power, even when they saddled it with frustratingly long gearing, even when they ripped out its glorious flat 6 and replaced it with a turbocharged 4-cylinder, the Cayman still had something that made it special. It had connection, it had character, it had a beating heart. Electrification takes away all of those things. An EV Cayman might be fast, maybe even stupidly fast, but it won't have a soul. It won't have the mechanical connection between the driver and the machine. It won't have the rising wail of a flat 6 at 9,000 RPM, the precise click of a perfectly weighted gear shift, or the delicate dance of a mid-engine chassis working in perfect harmony with a high-strung combustion engine. Instead, it will be another silent, instant torque machine in a world where everything is already starting to feel the same. Porsche knows this. They know that EVs lose what makes cars like the Cayman special. They've already seen the backlash against electrified sports cars, the lukewarm response to hybridized Ferraris, the concern over an electric Corvette, the outright resistance to battery-powered versions of driver's cars. But they don't care. The decision has been made. Porsche isn't evolving the Cayman anymore. They're putting it down. Yes, the electric Cayman will be quick. It will handle beautifully. The engineers will do everything they can to make it feel like a Cayman. But it won't be a Cayman. It will be a different kind of car, wearing the same name, but missing the essence of what made every previous version great. Porsche has spent nearly 2 decades keeping the Cayman in its place, making sure it never overshadowed the 911. And now, they're doing the one thing worse than holding it back. They're making sure the Cayman, as we know it, never comes back. Because at the end of the day, Porsche didn't just cripple their own supercar. They're about to erase it entirely.